All right, so we're diving into some seriously heavy stuff today. The aftermath of Cyclone Nargis in Burma.
Yeah, a fascinating, albeit tragic case study.
We've got your research right here, and it's a mix of like firsthand accounts, historical analysis, the works.
It's like trying to piece together a puzzle where someone's actively hiding half the pieces, you know?
Totally, and that's what we're going to try to unpack today, right? Like how the Burmese government tried to essentially bury a catastrophe under a mountain of misinformation.
Exactly. It's about uncovering those hidden pieces, understanding the human cost of this information blackout.
So, like, imagine this. You've got a natural disaster, one of the deadliest cyclones in history, but the immediate aftermath is just eerily quiet.
Yeah, the research describes Rangoon Airport, which is usually bustling, right? It was practically a ghost town after the cyclone hit.
That's so eerie, like the calm before the storm, but in reverse.
Right, and that silence, that unsettling calm, it's the first sign that something's really, really wrong.
Because in that kind of situation, you'd expect chaos, right? A flurry of activity, aid pouring in.
Absolutely. But instead, there's this deliberate attempt to control the narrative, to manage the optics of the disaster.
And that's where the censorship comes in, right?
Yeah, and it wasn't just like limiting press coverage, it was a full-blown blackout.
So what did that look like in practice?
It was pretty systematic, actually.
Uh-huh.
Independent journalists barred from entering the country.
Wow.
Foreign aid workers delayed, stonewalled, given every bureaucratic hurdle imaginable.
So basically they shut down any outside perspective?
Precisely. And for the people trapped inside Burma, those who were relying on official channels for information,
Right. What were they hearing?
they were being fed a sanitized, heavily edited version of events.
Like, to what extent?
Images of the devastation.
Yeah.
Confiscated, replaced with staged photos of officials handing out aid.
Oh, way.
Stories of loss and suffering. Suppressed, replaced with stories of resilience and recovery.
So you're telling me if I was a citizen in Burma at the time relying on state-run media, I would have absolutely no idea of the true scale of the disaster.
That's exactly right.
Wow, and that's the danger of information control, right? Like it creates this alternate reality.
It preys on people's trust, their need for accurate information, and it can have devastating consequences.
And this is what I find so inspiring, the Burmese people, they weren't just passively accepting this propaganda.
Oh, absolutely not. They were desperate for the truth.
And that's where those underground DVDs come in, right? The ones smuggled out of the Delta showing the real aftermath of the cyclone.
It's incredible, isn't it?
Totally.
Risking their safety, their freedom, to make sure the world knew what was really happening.
It's a testament to, I don't know, the human need to bear witness to make sure that atrocities like this aren't swept under the rug.
Exactly. And those DVDs, they painted a very different picture, a stark contrast to the government's narrative.
Talk about a reality check. You've got these official pronouncements talking about efficient aid distribution, and then you have these raw, first-hand accounts from the Delta that tell a very different story.
Right. We're talking about shortages of food, water, medicine.
Essential supplies.
Absolutely. And there were even reports of aid being diverted, ending up in the hands of the military or corrupt officials.
It's infuriating, the level of disregard for human suffering.
It really exposes the danger of relying solely on a single source of information, especially when that source has a vested interest in maintaining a certain narrative.
So it's like, how do you even begin to navigate a situation like that, where truth itself is so contested?
Well, it highlights the importance of media literacy, right? Seeking out diverse perspectives, questioning everything.
And sometimes those perspectives come from the most unexpected places. Like, get this, the research mentions this Burmese tradition of dabong, these rhyming prophecies that circulated through communities.
Almost like a cultural coping mechanism.
Exactly. And one of these dabong apparently predicted the government's move to Naypyidaw years before it actually happened.
It's unsettling, isn't it?
Totally.
Like these whispers of discontent somehow anticipating a major political shift.
And speaking of unsettling, the source also mentions this strange story about the government mass planting physic nuts.
Physic nuts?
Yeah, like the nut.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Okay, so apparently there was this rumor going around that physic nuts could, like, counteract Aung San Suu Kyi's astrological power.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, and the government, they took it seriously enough to actually start planting these things on a massive scale.
Wow, that's wild.
It sounds almost comical, right? Like a government making decisions based on astrological paranoia. But when you think about it, it's actually pretty chilling.
Definitely, it speaks to a certain desperation, a fear of losing control that went way beyond rational thought. It wasn't just about Aung San Suu Kyi, though.
Right.
This paranoia, it extended to, like, any perceived threat to their authority, even their own people.
And that brings us to, I guess, a turning point in Burma's history, the Saffron Revolution.
A pivotal moment for sure.
It's hard to wrap your head around it, right? The
Yeah.
monks, who are usually these symbols of peace, they become symbols of resistance against this brutal military junta.
It's a powerful image, yeah.
Totally. So how did that even happen?
What all started with this seemingly minor incident in Pukoku, where security forces cracked down on protesters.
Okay.
And it was brutal, totally excessive force for what was essentially a peaceful demonstration.
So that was the spark.
Yeah, it ignited years of simmering resentment, anger over the economic hardship, the political oppression.
Right, because this wasn't happening in a vacuum.
Exactly. It was like this incident just like ripped the lid off this pressure cooker of discontent.
And suddenly you've got these monks in their saffron robes leading protests, demanding change.
And the regime, they were clearly caught off guard.
They must have been terrified.
Absolutely. This wasn't some fringe group. It was the monks. It was the heart of Burmese society.
Right, which makes the regime's response even more appalling.
They reacted with violence, as they always did.
Live ammunition against unarmed protesters.
Yeah. Raids on monasteries, mass arrests.
It's just sickening, the level of brutality.
It really shows you the lengths they were willing to go to hold on to power, no matter the cost.
And you think about those monks facing down the military, knowing the risks. It's incredibly brave.
It's a testament to the power of faith, of conviction, the belief that some things are worth fighting for, even in the face of danger.
And it's even more striking when you contrast that with Than Zui's lifestyle at the time.
The juxtaposition is, yeah, pretty incredible.
Here you have these monks risking their lives for the sake of their people, and their leader is off building gold-plated pagodas and throwing lavish parties for his granddaughter.
The source really emphasizes this disconnect, the sheer opulence of Than Shui's regime compared to the suffering of his people.
He was obsessed with these grandiose projects, right? Like not just restoring ancient palaces, but building a whole new capital city, Naypyidaw.
A vanity project through and through, a monument to his own ego.
It's like he was trying to build himself a throne while his country was literally falling apart around him.
That's a pretty apt analogy, actually.
Yeah. Right. And meanwhile, in the Delta, people are struggling to survive, to rebuild their lives after this unimaginable disaster.
The research really brings those stories to life. The harrowing accounts of loss, of resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship.
Do any of them stand out?
One that really stuck with me was about this man who, even though he lost everything in the cyclone, he would still meticulously lock his few remaining possessions every night.
Really?
Yeah, it was like a way of holding on to some semblance of order, of normalcy in a world that had been completely upended.
It's heartbreaking, but also, like you said, resilient.
Exactly. It's that human capacity for adaptation, for finding ways to cope, even when it seems like all hope is lost.
But also begs the question, right? Like, how much can people endure before that resilience starts to fray?
It's a valid question, especially in a situation like this, where the very people who are supposed to be helping are actively making things worse.
That's the tragedy of Cyclone Nargis, isn't it? It wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a man-made catastrophe.
Compounded by greed, by paranoia, by a fundamental disregard for human life.
And it highlights this crucial point. Recovering from a disaster like this isn't just about rebuilding infrastructure. It's about addressing the underlying trauma, the broken trust.
It's about creating a system where people are less vulnerable in the first place, so they're not constantly having to bounce back from these incredibly difficult situations.
And that requires a fundamental shift in thinking, right?
Yeah.
In how we value human life, how we prioritize compassion and justice.
Exactly, because true resilience isn't just about surviving, it's about creating a world where people can truly thrive. And a big part of that is breaking the cycle of silence.
Right, because if we think about it, like information is power, then silence, especially in the wrong hands, can be a weapon.
Absolutely. And in Burma's case, the regime, they were masters at wielding that weapon, at silencing dissent.
So knowing what we know now, like, How do you even begin to fight back against that when the truth is so effectively silenced?
Well, the research points to the power of individual stories, of people refusing to be silenced.
Right, like those underground DVDs we talked about.
Well, exactly. They were a way of reclaiming the narrative, of showing the world the reality that the regime was trying so hard to hide.
And it wasn't just about exposing the lies, it was about honoring the resilience of the people who survived.
Absolutely. Those stories of survival, of community support, of clinging to hope in the darkest of times, they're incredibly powerful.
It's like that saying, right? They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds.
Exactly. And those seeds, they found fertile ground in the most unexpected places, like in Burmese folktales and traditions.
The source mentions this one story, the abbot is frying eggs. Have you heard of it?
I have, yeah. It's about this merchant who's obsessed with living a perfectly moral life.
Right, like he becomes a vegetarian, builds a monastery, the whole 9 yards.
But no matter what he does, he can't escape the suffering that's all around him.
It's almost like a cautionary tale, right? About the limits of individual action in the face of larger systemic issues.
And the importance of compassion, of acknowledging that suffering, even when we can't directly alleviate it.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity, even in the midst of tragedy. Which brings us to another story from the research, the tale of Uncle Sin.
Oh, yes, the mysterious Uncle Sin.
Right, so for those who haven't heard it, it's about this figure who supposedly helped a lot of people during the cyclone.
But here's the thing, no one can actually remember seeing him.
It's like a collective hallucination almost, a shared myth that emerged from the trauma of the disaster.
And it makes you wonder, right, like, did Uncle Shin even exist, or was he a figment of their collective imagination?
Maybe a way of coping, of finding hope in a moment of profound despair?
It's certainly possible, and it speaks to the power of the human mind to create meaning, even in the face of unimaginable suffering.
We find ways to cope, to make sense of the chaos, and sometimes those coping mechanisms, they can be incredibly powerful, even if they aren't based in, like, concrete reality.
Exactly. And speaking of coping mechanisms, the source ends on this really poignant note with a poem about the water hyacinth.
War Heisa.
Yeah, it's this incredibly resilient plant. You know, it thrives even in the harshest conditions, constantly pushing forward.
I see where you're going with this.
It's a beautiful metaphor for the Burmese people, don't you think? Facing unimaginable challenges, yet, like the water hyacinth, they continue to persevere.
Finding beauty, finding hope, even in the darkest of times.
It's a powerful reminder that even when everything seems broken, the human spirit, that capacity for hope and resilience, it can still find a way to bloom.
And maybe that's the most important takeaway from all of this, right? That even in the face of tragedy, of unimaginable loss, that spark of hope, of resilience, it never truly goes out.
It might flicker, it might be hard to see at times, but it's always there, waiting for the chance to ignite and remind us of the strength that lies within us all.
And that's a good note to end on, I think. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope, always the potential for growth and renewal.
And that those stories, those individual acts of courage and compassion, they deserve to be heard. They deserve to be remembered.
Absolutely. So thank you, as always, for sharing your expertise with us, for helping us unpack this incredibly complex and important topic.
Of course, it was my pleasure, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll be back next week with another episode, another story. Until then, take care.